evaluation of hazard and exposure of typhoons in Philippines using this tropical cyclone modeling with large eddy simulation and large eddy simulation. So the members of the thesis panel or defense panel, I'm Guillermo Tabios heading the as a chair, and then we have of course Dr. Jaime Hernandez, my colleague at the Institute of Civil Engineering. He's the advisor actually, and then we have a reader, Gerry Bagtasa of the Institute of Environmental Science Management of UP Diliman. So let's listen to his presentation, and then after that, we'll have some Q&A. But I think the panel can always come in, and if you need to intervene right away, you can ask questions. And then in the Q&A, we will allow the audience to ask questions. And then from there, we'll have a closed session. What is that? What do you call that, Jaime? We will,
Deliberation.
yeah, but we will, yung mga Joshua will put him on the waiting room.
Waiting room, yes.
Okay, so we'll now give the floor to Joshua for his presentation. Thank you very much for the afternoon for this audience, but only one I see, Ramon. Isa lang ba o si Racoma pala, and then yeah.
Kami hahabol.
Okay, so we'll just let them in. Okay, Joshua, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Tabios, for chairing this oral defense, and also thank you to Dr. Gerry Bagtasa for being the panel leader. And I also thank everyone for attending this Zoom meeting to bear watch of this oral defense. I am Joshua C. Agar, an MS Civil Engineering student from the Institute of Civil Engineering with a graduate research entitled Site-Specific Evaluation of Hazard and Exposure of Typhoons in the Philippines using Tropical Cyclone Modeling and Large Eddy Simulation, with Dr. Jaime Hernandez as my thesis advisor. So for the outline of my presentation, will involve discussing about the background, then the objectives, then the definitions of the parameters involved, the methodology, the summary, conclusions, and recommendations. The study centers upon typhoons, which frequented on the Philippines, an archipelagic nation situated along the typhoon belt, which in turn became exposed to the hazards that typhoon bring, particularly on severe winds, on which this thesis is focused on. Severe winds amount to risks such as casualties, damage to infrastructure, damage to agriculture, and disruption of the economy. To address the said risk in the engineering side, engineers implement sturdier designs against winds, which are detailed in the wind code provisions of the National Structural Code of the Philippines, currently at its 2015 edition. One of its major updates when being compared to the 2010 edition was the updated basic wind speed map, shown on the right. According to the description of the current basic wind speed map, the wind speeds were derived from the generalized extreme value analysis of the wind speeds recorded across synoptic stations of Bagtasa all over the Philippines, with a 3% probability of exceedance in 50 years. However, comparing the extreme values derived on the left reveal differences with the basic wind speed map on the right. For example, in Catanduanes, the GEV functions returned 401 kilometers per hour, while in the map it was detailed, the basic wind speeds were detailed to be 330 kilometers per hour. On the other hand, for example, in Mindanao, for General Santos City, the GEV functions return 140.35 kilometers per hour, while the maps detailed a basic wind speed of 310 kilometers per hour. Also, using GB analysis on the station data alone is only applicable for winds of non-cyclonic nature. Only, for example, only the stations, for example, in Malaybalay, Butuan, Davao, and Cagayan de Oro exhibit those kind of winds.
I come from Malaybalay, Joshua.
Yes po.
Okay.
Okay. The basis of the wind speed maps, along with the rest of the updated code provisions, were carried over from the ASCE wind code provisions, which centers on the wind pressures rather than the winds themselves. In comparison with the other wind codes in countries such as Australia and Japan, where the local winds were first determined before evaluating the wind pressure themselves, taking more into consideration what's called wind exposure. With the methodology adopted from their Australian counterparts, Pagasa in its severe wind hazard and risk program aims to evaluate the cyclonic winds through a regional wind probability analysis, while also adapting the parameters for wind exposure from the Australian wind code, which does not translate to the wind exposure here in the Philippines. The typhoon simulation, on the other hand, which the Pagasa is doing, comes a long way, starting with the determination of the pressure field, which can be translated into the gradient wind by balancing the pressure gradient, Coriolis force, and centrifugal force. Then came the assumption that the radial distance is equal to radius of curvature, resulting to the gradient wind equation as a function of the radial distance, as shown in number 3. Column number 4 determines the relation of the shape parameters A and B with respect to the parameters of the tropical cyclones, with A being related to the radius of maximum winds and B being related to the maximum winds themselves. Uh, the translation of the storm shown in 5 is now also being considered, so there's an additional component here in determining the gradient wind. However, even so, as Holland found out, the gradient wind does not equate entirely into the surface wind. Attempts have been made by researchers such as Giorgio in 1983 and Fuji and Mitsuta in 1986 to convert the gradient wind into the surface wind. It is with the consideration of the typhoon boundary layer done by Meng in 1995 that an introduction of it basically you introduce an additional component which was caused by the surface friction, leading to close estimates. That friction was, however, identified in terms of roughness length. As observed in wind tunnel tests, about roughness length, with the wind flow requires a certain development length to presume a boundary layer profile with a certain roughness length. This has been acknowledged by all of the codes. So on the top right is the development length detailed in NSCP. The assumptions of the boundary layer no longer applies for complex terrain and urban settings to circumvent the conventions regarding how a wind flow over a domain. A hybrid model was introduced where the magnitude of the free friction-free surface wind was determined using the gradient wind equation, while its dissipation over the complex terrain was simulated using computational fluid dynamics, yielding results even closer to the field measurements. What complicates every CFD analysis, however, is modeling turbulence. There are two turbulence models at hand. First is the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equation, or RANS, which treats the turbulent effects as additional average effects, and large eddy simulation, which treats turbulent flow as superimposition of eddies of different sizes. So the comparison is shown on the top left. At top right is a flow simulation using RANS. On the bottom right is the flow simulation using LEDs. The large eddy simulation originated from the energy cascade theory proposed by Richardson in 1922. This means that when this means higher turbulent kinetic energy will mean higher range of eddies whose superimposition could lead to higher peak gas. The previous hybrid model, the one done by Wang and Zhu in 2014, uses RANS in modeling turbulence, which only account to the average effects. Of course, the study focused more on evaluating the wind pressures. This study, however, proposes using the hybrid model using large eddy simulation instead. So for this study, The objectives were to determine the site-specific parameters for wind hazard and exposure by post-processing the wind fields replicated by the previous severe wind events. So for the wind hazard, there's magnitude of typhoon sustained wind. For the wind exposure gas factor, this includes gas factors, wind directionality factors, and wind profile. And to define each one, so we start with the gas factors. These are conversion factors used to determine the 3-second gas from the sustained wind given a degree of wind exposure. So for types of exposure, for example, inland, off land, off sea, and at sea. So there are a set of gas factors to be implemented. So these were the guidelines from the World Meteorological Organization compiled by Harper, Keppert, and Ginger in 2010. The wind directionality, of the other hand, in contrast to the NACP definitions, determines which direction was the location most exposed to the severe wind. So, for example, uh, if the location experiences higher winds coming from the northeast, then you assign a higher wind directionality factor or wind direction factor at that sector. The roughness length determines the horizontal mean profile near the ground. So the horizontal mean profile was assumed to be logarithmic in nature, and it's mainly controlled by the roughness length. So uh, so we proceed now with the discussion of the methodology. So the methodology relies on the weather stations and the typhoon track. So these are the data coming from the weather stations, and this is the data coming from the storm track in order to determine the pressure field of the typhoon. So it eventually converges and leads to the pressure field modeling. Using the pressure field, the typhoon field is then simulated, which is then used as the input. So this is the result of the typhoon wind field modeling. That this will be used as an input to the computational fluid dynamics, the analysis involving computational fluid dynamics, which also involves a complex terrain. So once the simulated winds were validated with respect to the actual data, the site specific of the for exposure can now be post-processed. The methodology includes modeling the pressure field from the weather stations, observing the passage of the typhoon. The time history of the pressure data were then related to the proximity of the storm in order to determine the pressure versus distance graph. The pressure points were then fitted into a rectangular hyperbolic profile proposed by Schlomer in 1957. However, the main difference is that the pressure isobars, instead of being considered as concentric circles, they will be considered as ellipses. So the radii of curvature will be determined also in this procedure. Using the radii of curvature, the pressure gradient, the Coriolis force, the centrifugal force, the typhoon wind field will be then determined, which will be used as the input in the CFD analysis as mentioned earlier. For the CFD analysis, instead of France, we will be using LES, which treats turbulence as superimposition of eddies of different sizes. A complex terrain is generated using the elevation data from OpenStreetMap. To reduce the computational load, the buildings are reduced to mostly rectangular blocks, but still carrying the key dimensions such as length, width, and height. Also, the computational model is scaled to 1:10. As a result, the velocities are also scaled 1:10 in retaining the similitude with regards to the Reynolds number. Then the simulated winds will be compared to the recorded winds for the validated procedure. The post-processing, on the other hand, includes fitting the boundary layer profile across all points to determine the roughness length in comparison of the freezer. Gas factors, on the other hand, are determined by comparing the magnitude of the friction-free surface wind to the local winds. Then you divide the local winds to a magnitude of the local winds with respect to the magnitude of the free-friction surface wind. Then you evaluate the gas factors. And finally, we also evaluate the directional deviations of the local winds. And to add to that, we also determine turbulence intensities. The methodology was implemented on 2 cases. The first one is being Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. To determine the shape of the pressure isobars, the surface weather maps from Japan Meteorological Agency was used. So this was their pressure map determined at 8 a.m. So this was after Leyte landfall. The pressure isobars were then fine-tuned using pressure readings from the automated weather stations of the Advanced Sciences and Technology Institute, or ASTI, highlighted in blue. So these 3. As the synoptic stations of Pag-asa, particularly in Tacloban and Giwan, highlighted in yellow markers, suffered extensive damage during the passage of Typhoon Haiyan. Knowing the pressure field and the shape of the ellipses, the friction-free surface wind was determined using the gradient wind equation. So this is the whole equation that I use in determining the gradient wind. In this case, it was 59.83 meters per second, coming from it at the direction of 10 degrees south-southwest. 59.83 meters per second then becomes the inlet velocity for the CFD analysis. The simulated winds were then related to the actual reading of the automated weather station of ASTI, which is marked as X in the figure, where a peak 2-second gust of 64.1 meters per second was observed. The wind simulated were originally instantaneous, so to get the 2-second peak gust, we have to average the winds in a time period of 2 seconds. So getting that 2-second averages yields peak 2-second gust of 66.26 meters per second with a difference of 2.6 meter per second from the actual data. Being close enough to the other points in the computational domain were then post-processed. The post-processing involves 5 sections. 4 sections were streets in Bantayan, namely Quezon Street. So this is Quezon Street, Rodriguez Street, Osmeña Street, and Ibanez Street. The last section is the central section, bisecting the computational domain, passing through buildings. Among the post-processed data were gas factors, roughness lengths, and directional deviations of the local winds. Also displayed in these figures, in the subsequent figures that I'll be showing, were black lines which indicate the surface elevation. In this section, as do with the second case, the flow, as you analyze the flow, treatment of the graph is that the flow always moves from right to left. So we start with the Quezon Street and we evaluate the roughness length. Evaluating the roughness length reveals its relationship with regards to the building density. So in this case, so this is the region where higher building density was observed. So it is the higher the building density, the higher roughness lengths were observed. So ranging from 0.1 to 3.5. When there's lower building density, then you would observe lower roughness lengths. Also being inclined with respect to the general wind direction, naturally the street was the most shielded among the streets mentioned, resulting only when evaluating the peak gust across the whole street, the peak gust was determined to be 1.33. And however, when being compared, and now being compared that with Rodriguez Street, with the location highlighted on the top. So this is the location of Rodriguez Street, and the values highlighted in the plots below. The peak gas of 1.98 was observed. So the higher peak gas were observed at Rodriguez Street. The same behavior of roughness length can be observed in Rodriguez Street, with the roughness length being higher at regions of higher building density, now ranging up to 5 meters compared that to the peak of 3.5 meters at Quezon Street. So same behavior, lower building density, lower roughness length. For the most exposed street, Ibanez Street, when being compared to the to other streets, so uh, the street exhibited more erratic directional deviations. So the local winds veered left and right along the street. So you can see from this is, for example, this is 0, the wind veers from left and veers from right, so on and so forth. For plotting the directional deviation with respect to the gas factors reflected to the fact that as local winds became aligned to the direct direction of the general wind, the more it is likely to build up momentum, resulting to higher peak gas. So if the local winds deviate more from the general wind direction, you would expect that lower peak gas will be observed. On the other hand, on Osmeña Street, out of the 15,700 points post-process, only 500 points made it past the filtering process. This indicates that most of the wind flow moving through the street lost its logarithmic profile. This has to do with the assumption in the boundary layer profile where only the ground is bringing shear stresses to the flow. In cases such as Osmeña Street, where most of the mid-rise buildings are situated, so these are the mid-rise buildings, the shear stresses also now originate from the buildings themselves, so causing a disruption on the vertical wind profile. This also caused downdrafts, which damaged the already deteriorating Escario house at the end of Osmeña Street. So the Escario house is marked as X in the in the figure. So this is the Escario house. Finally, with the central section, which will cover which will cover how the exposure parameter changes when there are buildings involved. So we highlight this section. It reveals how that as the wind flow changes elevation from, for example, from sea level to a certain elevation after the beach, after encountering the beach. Initial amplification occurs where the wind picks up momentum. Then naturally, the wind flow separates, causing a decrease in the gas factor. So this, for example, this is the beach. Then you observe an initial amplification. Then as flow separates, you observe a decrease in the gas factors. Then as the wind flow reattaches to the ground, momentum picks up again, resulting to higher peak gas, shown here. On the other hand, as wind flow changes over the changing ground elevation, the roughness length decreases. So once it encounters the beach, there's a sudden change in elevation, flow channeling is observed. We observe that the roughness length decreases. So from it decreases up to 0.01 meters. Then as wind flow reattaches, the roughness length follows a normal value of around 0.5 meters to 1.5 meter to 1 meter. The same behavior of the roughness length were also observed in instances where the wind flow encounters a building with the wind separation, with the flow separation causing an increase in roughness length up to 1.5 meters and the reattachment and contraction causing a decrease in the roughness length up to 0.01 meters. Turbulence intensity can be computed by obtaining the in the simulation. So the turbulence intensity can be computed by evaluating the standard deviation of the fluctuating flow divided with the mean wind speed, then you get your turbulence intensity. On the other hand, there's also a prescribed value for the turbulence intensity, which can be determined as proposed by previous researchers using the roughness lengths. So comparing that to the empirical values that which are determined from the roughness lengths values alone. So this along y is the turbulence intensity computed using this equation. This assumption came from a study involving boundary layer flows at higher latitudes. So with the Philippines being on lower latitudes, of course, this no longer applies. And also in a complex terrain where the ground is not the only one causing shear stresses to the flow, this no longer applies. So basically, naturally, the these two will no longer be equivalent. So this reveals differences since we are now dealing with complex terrains. Now shift to the second case, which was Typhoon Nina in 2016. The study uses the following weather stations as observation points. So these 5 with Virac station as the validation point. So the pressure field modeling and the subsequent typhoon field modeling returns a value of the friction-free surface wind to be around 38.33 meters per second. However, the winds were coming from the east, meaning inland, northeast, meaning inland. To take into account the change of exposure in the inlet boundary conditions, the friction-free surface wind has to be multiplied by a gas factor, which in this case was 1.66. The wind flow across a kilometer-long domain was initiated after 25 seconds, with the flow imbalance resolved after initialization, shown here. The flow began to exhibit its fluctuating characteristics. That's where to begin our observation period. Since this is a synoptic station, in contrast to the automated weather stations of ASTI, where Bagtasa uses the standard 3-second averaging period to determine the peak gas, which in this case is determined to be 54 meters per second. We now use a time averaging period of 3 seconds in evaluating the peak gas. The simulated peak gas was determined to be 57.83 meters per second over here, and it has an average value of 54.7 meters per second. This in comparison to the actual recording of the rock station to be about 54 meters per second. Okay. The wind flow, initially in the computational domain, the wind flow passes through the vicinity of the Catanduanes State University, then it passes through the Virac Airport, then it encounters a light escarpment as shown in the elevation profile here, before reaching the weather station itself. Plotting the gas factors with respect to the ground elevation shows a positive relationship between the change of peak gas to the change in elevation, starting at 1.36, then hitting at 1.64 at the escarpment, then decreasing to as low as 1.43 as the flow descends by the time it reaches the station. Sorry. Wait a minute. Plotting the roughness length, on the other hand, reveals the same behavior on how the roughness length changes over the change of terrain. From a more inlet terrain, the roughness length transition into a much steadier value as it was given length and ample space to develop. So from around 0.7, it develops into a 0.3 roughness length. Then as it encountered the much flatter runway, it then transitions into a new roughness length. So the flat begins to descend. But before it reaches a constant value, the wind encountered the escarpment. So as previously mentioned, when there's a change in elevation, positive change in elevation, there's a negative change in the roughness length, so causing a decrease in the roughness length. So the roughness length decreased from around 0.18 meters to 0.06 meters. Evaluating the simulated turbulence intensity and the turbulence intensity derived from the turbulence length, as previously done in the case of Typhoon Haiyan, shows that at low latitudes such as the Philippines, the previous assumptions no longer applies, though we can observe that there's still a positive relationship between the prescribed and the simulated values. So in summary, Typhoon Haiyan in the Typhoon wind field modeling, Typhoon Haiyan at 8:30 a.m. was determined to have a minimum central pressure of 923 hectopascals. The recorded peak gas at this time was 64.1 meters per second, and simulation returned 66.26 meters per second. On the other hand, for Typhoon Nina, the minimum central pressure was determined to be 948.88 hectopascals. The recorded peak gas by the station was 54 meters per second, and the simulated peak gas, the peak gas simulated was 57.83 meters per second. The conclusions, so we now lead to the conclusion. So we conclude that the increase of gastiness shows a positive relationship with the increase of elevation with respect to the general wind direction. So there's a change in elevation, then we then observe we can expect that there's a positive change in the gas factor. So there will be an increase in the gastiness. This works on both cases. So the cases on Bantayan and the cases on Verac, same was observed. The change in gas factors, roughness length, the change in gas factors and roughness length are also indicative of the flow separation, channeling, and reattachment. So this is the plot, uh, sample plot for encountering the building. And for example, in the beach, this what happens. This is the visualization of the flow upon encountering the beach. So this is the beach. There's a change in elevation. There's a channeling. Then there's flow separation. Then there's flow reattachment. The provisions and formulas for turbulence intensity is found out to be to only apply for isolated conditions. So if it involves urban setting or complex terrain, the prescripted values for the turbulence intensity no longer applies. The boundary layer also diminishes on areas with mid-rise structures, as the assumptions of the boundary layer no longer applies with the additional shear regions. With this given methodology, we can now perform citywide evaluation of wind exposure to project the local wind effects. We transition from an area-based approach where we treat a certain area with a constant roughness length. Then we can then project the local winds, and we treat that area. We treat that our treatment will be that the area experiences the same winds. So that was the previous approach, the area-based approach. We can now transition to a feature-based approach, so site-specific evaluation, site-specific evaluation of the magnitude of the winds and the exposure parameters. Quantifying the wind exposure for complex terrain can be mostly divided into two: the changes, the effects of the ground elevation. So if there's a change in ground elevation, we can observe an increase or decrease depending on how the ground elevation changes, and the wind interference among building wind envelopes. My recommendations, as I encounter shortcomings in performing this research, are to develop. One is to develop an asymmetrical 2D model for the pressure field. So even though I began to consider ellipses, still there's symmetry in the pressure field model. That I derived. So in post processing further the data, the exposure parameters that the complex terrain analysis did. So we can now derive empirical formulas to predict the wind exposure for cases such as complex terrain. Then we can now proceed with the simulation of the past typhoons while using the hybrid procedure as the validation in order to generate virtual meteorological data, which will result to the regional wind speed map or basic wind speed map. With this study establishing the guidelines in predicting wind exposure, uh, it is recommendable to conduct the same analysis for most or all areas in the Philippines. These are the references that I use in this research. And with that, I close my presentation, and I'll be now entertaining questions from our audience and our panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua, for the presentation. Quite a nice one to see.
Mm.
So maybe anyone from the panel can ask first if you have anything.
Well, to get the ball rolling, I'm the advisor, so I've asked already a lot of questions from our. I would like, but he did not include it in the presentation, and I think it's an important information for us to know as well. How long did the runs, how long were the computer runs in simulating tawag dito, this city-wide CFD?
For the case of Typhoon Haiyan, so let me roll back the slides a little bit. So the overall, it took me around or over a month to simulate. On the other hand, for the kilometer-long computational domain of Typhoon Nina, it took me 2 months to simulate.
Ano klaseng computer yung
Yeah,
ginamit mo?
maybe you should.
Ano lang, i7, single computer.
Okay.
HPC assistance.
Running time ba yun? Yung 1 month? Yun ba?
Opo.
Yung simulation time compared to computational time, what's the
The simulation time for the
so Typhoon Haiyan, for example, how many
was
hours?
25 seconds. So it took me the computational time. The computational time was over a month. On the
For a
other hand,
25-second win event.
yes po.
Oh. Pero i7 lang, no? Hindi naman.
Oo nga, i7.
i7 7th gen.
And hindi napaparallel or nakaparallel yung
Nakaparallel na po siya.
I see.
Gamit na po yung computer.
What if i7 with parallel processing?
Pwede pong i-distribute among processors po yung ano.
You're using explicit scheme ba dito?
Oh.
You're using explicit scheme?
Or
what is your numerical or
okay.
discretization? Numerical discretization.
So in this case, I use the open source software called OpenFOAM in simulating the wind flow. So this would require. Can you repeat the question, sir?
Kasi I was trying to read the thesis, this OpenFOAM. In fact, I wasn't so clear how the computations are done because you just showed the methodology and then, but never really look at the method of, and if it's hybrid, finite difference, finite element, or finite volume. But I didn't really see in particular, although, you have been, in fact, that's another story later. But in other words, if you're using an explicit scheme, then I could see how you could parallelize or vectorize your computation. But it's implicit scheme, then you cannot just do that. So the question is, if you're using one i7, one processor, then you cannot do a parallel processing.
Yes.
You have to have several, cores or connected computers to do this.
i7 po has 8 cores po. Then parang ang naging limiting factor po actually sa simulation is yung random access memory po. So kung anong
No, I have i7 with four cores at the core, pero I don't have the compiler to do parallel processing. I mean, it's two things though. Yung core is something else. It's another thing that you have separate processors that is integrated into, But anyway, you didn't see that in particular.
ang ginamit po nila is MPI.
What is that MPI?
Multi-parsing interface.
So it's not quite
It's like
a real vectorized form, bale. Maybe Gerry,
Yeah, para siyang library to distribute the computation. Pero yes, I understand yung question niya, sir, na kung implicit nga siya kung paano I suppose dun sa software architecture yung nakaayos na yun.
because it has something to do with the how you first of all develop the program, secondly how you compiled, and how then it's being distributed in a multiprocessor and a system.
Mm.
For instance, if I do a explicit scheme, let's say I do it in hydraulic model in the lake, let's say, I can divide, let's say, out of 10,000 grids. If I have 10 processors, I can divide into 1,000 grids per processor, bale, and
Mm.
they will be processed at the same time. And then
Okay.
every time step, I'll just integrate the results, and then I go to the next time step.
Okay.
I was just wondering, maybe something to do with what Dr. Jaime was asking about the computational time needed, which is quite a constraint because, of course, you're doing 3D here,
Mm.
which is quite constraining. In fact, I've done 3D myself, but doing simulation for 1 hour, maybe it will take about 2 days in a 1,000 core computer, which is a, my i7 here is a 40 megaflops computation, mega floating point operation, but maybe a 1,000 core, 1,000 times faster. So it's 1/10. I mean, 1/1,000 time instead of 2 days, maybe just a few minutes to do that. In other words, okay.
Actually, I was asking that question because I was thinking how much time it would require if we wanted to do something as big as the Philippines. Do it for many places in the country, many cities or towns. This type of simulation and modeling, be able to come up with the parameters, exposure parameters that we could use in design of buildings and different structures. So, pero ang tagal pala, no?
Yeah, it's quite constraining. In fact, I was in Colorado. I finished in Colorado State University, and then 2007 I was there. They have a big wind tunnel, and then I visited the university, and then so they were still doing physical modeling in the wind tunnel, and I was asking, there this LES method now that you can use. They told me that they have these clients from some cities. They want to do this, do that. If you do LES, we cannot uh, run so many cases. It's gonna take, and I think that's what they meant during that time. But that's 13 years ago. But then
And
physical modeling for that matter is still going to be much faster and easier.
Yeah.
With these kinds of.
mm,
If I may ask a question, as far as let's say your roughness scales are or roughness parameter, that's why you adopted this roughness parameterization based on some velocity or some other factors as opposed to using fixed, because then you'll have this issue of you have your, you know, uh, atmospheric equations, put it that way, the aerodynamics of your mass momentum and then your pressure. And then you have even the turbulence component, which is no longer the K epsilon, but the LES turbulence equation. And then you have a roughness parameter, which is also another equation, right?
yes.
Because in hydraulics, actually, we do that for purposes of non-Newtonian mechanics. When the roughness friction coefficient and so on, it's even another differential equation, which is a function of, it's not maybe what I saw in your case where it's even just one analytical equation, but we solve that explicitly as another differential equation because it will be a function of the turbulent shear stresses, dispersive stresses, we have then the friction and so on. So it will be a combination of this. But if you were to do fix, let's say you specify, you don't have a roughness length of that's changing over space or I don't know if you changed in time. How good is that? Maybe you didn't do it, or I don't know if you did it, but how far are the literature values of these roughness lengths compared to what you compute? Because I see, for example, that over, let's say, longitudinal distance, they could go up, go down, depending if you have convergence or a channeling or, point separation. How would that compare to literature values if you just pick it up from that one?
Okay. To answer your question, sir, I would roll back a few slides in.
Mhm.
Wait a minute. So it's been many slides. So here, sir. So here are the compile. So uh, they also some meteorologists wait some researchers have already found out that the roughness length has some dynamic nature. So in order
Yeah.
to eliminate the complications, they try to establish what's called exposure. Terrain exposure. So they divide it into categories. Then in these categories, we lump that, for example, in sea conditions, these are the roughness lengths that you use
Yes. Mhm.
in and so on and so forth. So uh, with the assumption, parang it, this po came from the assumption that they allow the flow to develop over some distance so that they can be determined. However, in cases, for example, na point dito, na, the flow constantly undergoes transition. So it doesn't settle on a single roughness length.
Because in water, is in a channel, when we have flow vegetation, the we can account for the porosity of the vegetation. That means the
Yeah.
vertical scale,
That-
but we can also look at the height of the water. So the Manning's coefficient, for example, may be modified according to the depth of the water, which is basically what you're trying to do here. Instead of it will be the buildings as well as the you know the physical topographic features. In other words, I was just wondering if because in our case, for example, sometimes the fluctuation or the difference is maybe only 10-15% of the effect on the flow. So from a point of view of designing for, I mean, based on the flood flow, for example, we are maybe in error by 50%. So we don't really care anymore the flow depths, right? It's like it will be blanketed by other factors. But apparently here, the assumption is that you have this large scale eddies that's produced in an atmospheric uh, atmospheric condition. I mean, a sort of phenomenon. Then maybe that's a little bit different story. Maybe the roughness lengths could then be quite significant in trying to move things. Because in our case, the friction may not be as big as as far as the roughness scale may not be that so much different. But I was very interesting. By the way, one more thing. I was looking at your manuscript. Maybe in the or I don't know if we can discuss this here, but in the conclusions, maybe you can, if you can add some kind of implications to structures, because anyway, that's
okay.
as far rather than just talk about the aerodynamics of the flow here and there or the wind and so on. But I don't know if to what extent you can relate it as far as like I haven't seen some of the structures are really less than 9 meters, right? You did
Uh,
have structures like about high
there were
building.
some about 15 meters high, sir.
Yeah, but not maybe like the
Yes, sir.
if I look at the along Osmeña in Cebu, I thought there were buildings already like about 30 meters high in the new hotels or the new buildings there. So I guess you were just looking at along the streets, right?
Mm,
Along Osmeña, some of those streets where you don't have those high-rise,
yes po.
because then the roughness scale or length would be different because they are fairly a function of the building heights, right?
Yes po.
What would be the implication of that? Although you didn't compute them anymore, but
Mm,
will it be like maybe very small instead? Because it's everything is. In other words, if you look at the wind profile, really at the ground it will be smaller compared to the top. But
mm,
where is that? Maybe it will be like a different effect. That's what I'm saying.
mm.
Maybe just talk about some implication of that
Skip.
beyond what you have computed. In other words.
Explain ko po ba, sir, yung, yun nga, ayun po, sir, yung isa sa implications, one of the implications of, for example, there's a higher roughness length. So if an engineer was to determine the local winds at a certain local height, for example, they tend to design their buildings at uh, on which the input wind speed was determined at a certain mean roof height. So for example, there's a mean roof height of 3 meters. Then I
Mm.
want to get the local winds experience at that height. So in converting what's the wind at the magnitude of the winds at 10 meters high to magnitude of the winds at 3 meters high, you would be referring to the roughness lengths in the conversion. So if there's lower roughness length, that would indicate that the flow develops faster with respect to the ground. So in the engineer would determine higher wind speeds compared to that in instances when there was a high roughness length.
Yeah,
So
the reason why I mentioned that is because I could just again I'm working from the analogy of in water
mm,
beyond the boundary layer thickness. Then it will be basically turbulent flow. It's almost uniform on top.
mm,
I don't know about the wind, but I think the wind may be similar at a certain height. It will no longer be
yes,
like it will be just erratic or fluctuating from the mean you know profile compared to the when you have within the boundary layer thickness. So then if you have a building that's taller than I don't know 10 meters, or when it hits already the sort of the very rough boundary layer thickness, maybe you'll have a different implication.
yes po.
So maybe you
Uh,
can explain from that point of view. Or
this would include po many assumptions na po you would uh, consider na po yung not only yung horizontal gradient, for example, you have also
mm,
have to consider yung vertical gradient.
yeah, definitely vertical gradient will
Yes.
come in.
Mm,
But I thought that at that location, maybe whatever these eddies created by turbulence so on, it will be much more dissipated because the big energy, kinetic energy in the turbulent vortex generation will be really at the bottom, at the boundary layer where
mm,
you have the
yes.
different roughness features or effects. But anyway, these here and there. But anyway, that's to me it's just an interesting maybe discussion if you can, from the point of view of high buildings.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, but maybe I was dominating the questions. And you
Not a
can.
problem.
Siguro ako naman.
Sige, Gerry, sorry.
No, no, it's okay, sir. Since I saw this presentation before, I really don't have any other questions. I think the results are interesting and good.
Mm.
And yeah, maganda yung nagawa. However, I do have a lot of comments on your manuscript. Kasi yun yung bago ko nakita eh. Before we go on sa manuscript, no, siguro I assume na you're going to present this again, di ba, in some other forum. Siguro, ang isang comment ko is some of your slides are too busy. Sobrang daming figures and sobrang daming information. I think you can tone it down a little. Siguro 2 figures lang. Yung equations pwedeng bawasan kasi masyadong I think pag yung iba na tumitingin will be shocked with the some of the labels ng axis nawawala. And yung similar to your manuscript, yung inconsistent and significant figures. So like for example, may mga gas values ka na 9 decimal places, which is I find weird. Diba? I assume, diba, from computation kasi yon. Pero is it really important to show the, diba, after the third decimal place? Parang hindi na importante yun eh. So yung mga few comments ko lang sa, well, i-send ko na lang by email later. Pero yung mga major comments ko, siguro yung isa rito yung sabi mo yung cyclonic and non-cyclonic flow. So I assume you're talking about tropical cyclone, di ba?
Yes.
So sabi mo tropical cyclone kasi there are other cyclonic flows like may mga mesocyclones tayo, may tornado, may ipo-ipo. These are also cyclonic flows. So para lang clear. Tapos sa abstract mo, yung abstract should be a summary of your study. Pero yung sa pagkakasulat mo ng abstract, it's more of the rationale and the methods. So wala akong nakitang result na na-present sa abstract. So I think you can tone down on the rationale, tapos lagyan mo ng yung results ng kasi in fact maganda yung results eh, na medyo na-confuse ako sa abstract na walang any mention of your results. So I think dapat mas maraming results yung sa abstract mo. Dun sa sandali anahin ko lang ng So dun sa introduction, may history lesson which is interesting. Okay, don't get me wrong. Interesting, pero I feel that many of the historical narratives are irrelevant. So for example, sinabi mo na, di ba, from the time of Magellan, because of the galleon trade, may mga bagyo. That's very interesting. Pero hindi mo minention yung halimbawa, yung recent statistics ng pagtama ng bagyo sa Pilipinas. Like, di ba, 20 theses pumapasok sa PAR, and then around 10 nagla-landfall, which are very relevant to your study. So yung na-mention mo yung from 400 years ago, pero hindi mo na-mention yung last 40 years. Parang I find that a little strange. Tapos marami kang factual claims. Like si Magellan diba, for example, si Magellan naka-encounter ng bagyo, pero walang citation. So I find yung introduction mo lacks citation. So maraming And madali lang yan, di ba? Si Selga. Yes. I'm sure nakuha mo yun kay mostly kay Selga yung mga
Yes po.
So yun lang, i-cite mo lang siya. Yun. Also yung nahirapan akong i-follow yung manuscript kasi unang-una yung kakaunting sentence lang tapos ginagawa mong bagong paragraph. So like one paragraph consists of 2 sentences. So sometimes worse, 1 sentence lang, 1 paragraph. Parang that's very strange. Napapansin ko yan sa mga estudyante in the last 5 years. I suppose because of pag nagpo-post sa Facebook or Twitter, limited ka with the number of characters. Pero dito, you're not limited. Pwede ka mag-paragraph ng maraming sentences. Walang pumipigil sa'yo. And in fact, you should do that. Ito yung pinaka-major na comment ko, particularly on the results, no? It's very, very difficult to follow yung results mo kasi you're not referring to the figure. Hindi mo halos walang mention doon na figure this shows that ganon. You just started explaining everything without reference to which figure. Dito sa presentation mo, of course, when you're talking, tapos yung slide mo nandiyan sa figure na yan, of course, it's easy to assume na you're talking about the figure na pre-present mo sa slide. Pero pag sa manuscript, pag hindi ka nag-refer, it's very difficult to follow. So, sinasabi mo lang na yung, halimbawa yung gas, na hanap mo yung ganitong value, and this one, yung roughness, nagpalit, without referring to which figure.
Okay.
Kung ano exactly. So, yun yung, I think yun yung major na comment ko na ang hirap siyang i-follow kasi parang kailangan i-assume mo na kung ano figure. So, hindi ko ma-connect. So, I find it very difficult to read. Siguro yun lang. And it's actually easy to remedy kasi alam mo naman ano yung sinasabi mo, di ba? So, you just have to say na this is shown in this figure this shows ganito, and so on.
Yes.
I do have many other comments. Siguro i-send ko lang by email later. Pero yeah, ito yung major na comment ko on your manuscript. On the result itself and your presentation here, I think maganda yung ano. Yun lang nga, nagulat din ako ng haba pala ng time to run. So how can we do this for other places? So ang mangyayari talaga parang specific lang yung mga studies na magagawa. But maybe some other software, baka hindi ba mas mabilis kung yung, kasi si OpenFOAM, di ba, ano siya, open source na free. Kaya yung mga ibang paid like ANSYS or ano, baka may capability rin to do it faster. Would you know?
I checked. I also run with simulations po sa ANSYS. For a 32 gig na PC, may limitations po siya sa ano, kung ilang nodes yung pwede. Sa meshing pa lang po, hindi na siya tutuloy kung next na. Tapos yung ano po, parallel processing na capabilities po. Parang separate siya na ano, na may iba ka pang babayaran.
Software.
Yeah.
Are you done, Gerry?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. Since just to follow through yung kay Gerry, that's what I was saying earlier, na maybe I discuss it later, but maybe anyway, he already started it. So, yeah, in the manuscript, I saw that history nga na medyo mahaba, and then maybe some portion, I wanted to suggest, maybe you can put it in the appendix, which is parang lang hindi masyadong parang nagkaroon ng sideline pagkatapos you went back to the main theme. Similarly, yung part doon sa, when I was also reading this, when you sent me the copy before, yung part ng yung OpenFOAM, yung software, bale, you just put in yung mga screenshots ng the methodology, how you run it and so on. I think you can relegate that to the appendix also. I think it's that's how I see in other theses. So yung flow ng main methodology, and then your results and discussion later on diretso, bale, hindi yung we get sort of sidetracked because we have to deal with the software, how you run it and so on. You can put the appendix. It's very useful just for other students or even faculty or other people to learn, this kind of thing. But I think it should be relegated to yun na dala na notice ko na medyo parang nakaka-distract, so to speak, as far as the thesis, bale, which is you have the hypothesis, and then you have the anti-thesis and a thesis, and then synthesis. So parang tanggalin na yung part na yan.
Okay.
So para bang you really follow the hypothesis, the anti-thesis, the thesis, and the synthesis, bale, gano'n.
Okay.
Yan naging kwan yan of thesis. Side thesis in a sense.
Thank you po sa comment.
But otherwise, I agree. My comment, I agree with Gerry, and I think it's a very nice, the whole methodology and how you put up all this, review literature as well as how you then did it. But it's a good idea that also Dr. Jaime mentioned about the maybe in computing time. It's also important to mention that in the ano yun, yung discussion of results. That's also a big factor. Although Gerry, the College of Engineering through the UPERDFI, they have this initiative to put up a 25 million peso high performance computer. So there's going to be 1,000 core machine, and it's hopefully, but tapos na si Joshua, it will give us opportunity to expand our supposed numerical prowess in doing these kinds of things. Like in my case, I do a lot of I have experience in parallel processing. When I was abroad, I've worked in cyber first generation supercomputers, and then the Cray XMP, YMP, and so on. So I have quite an experience in programming. So you have to your program, how you do the computation should be amenable to parallel processing. It will, if otherwise, it will just be doing fast serial computing. You cannot do that. You have to design the program such that it's able to do parallel computations. In other words, if you are doing a do loop, instead of one do loop, maybe you have separate do loops, something like that. Okay. So anything else? Maybe some of our audience maybe wanting to ask questions. Maybe we can give you a 2-second period to ask questions. No, I'm just kidding. This Mr. Racoma, B.A. Racoma, it says.
Hi po, sir, and hi, Josh. Thank you for the presentation. Sorry, sumingit na lang ako sa conversation. I have a question, nilagay ko sa chat, pero sige, discuss ko na lang din. About the building data that you used, I understand na OSM yung ginamit natin.
Yes po.
How complete or consistent ito sa study sites? Kasi I understand some of these buildings have been mapped as collapsed or missing. And yung iba yata tinag namin as destroyed and walang building heights. So if wala silang heights, did you make assumptions about these heights?
Apart from sige. If I may add, I went actually to the
Oh, that's good.
site, so to evaluate whether I was modeling it right. So, however, syempre, I was constrained na lesser edges dapat para less yung computational time, kaya kailangan kwadrado na lang. So, what I verified na lang on the site mismo is yung heights talaga ng building and yung top view yung dimensions.
Sige, maghabol pa ako about the buildings. How do you think maepektuhan yung results mo kapag nasira nga yung building due to the strong wind speeds?
Masira like natanggal yung buong roof system, correct?
Yes, kunwari, di ba nahanginan siya ng super lakas tapos mag-collapse siya? Kasi in the model, we assume na static lang lahat to, no?
Ang assumption, hindi, sige. Siyempre mawawala na sa assumption yung conversion to degree. Pag natanggal yung bubong, actually, pag natanggal ang bubong, hindi ko pa actually na-consider kung natanggal. Parang I was considering na all of the structures were block bodies, kaya parang wala ganong interaction yung behavior ng structure with respect dun sa wind farm. Yun yung
Walang channeling papunta doon sa wind, sa structure.
Hindi ko na po parang na po, ma'am, a previous research in 2017 by Engineer Tan considered that, and she took her, parang ang laki ng load na kailangan. Ano bang roof, for example, anong roof panels yung matatanggal? Ni-determine niya yun. Then nire-run niya yung CFD simulation. Then nire-evaluate yung wind loads na na-experience ng structure. Then nire-run yung analysis and so on. Parang ang tagal ang tagal ng iterative procedure na nangyari sa yun yung nagpatagal po actually. So, yun yung mostly iniiwasan dati. Pero ngayon in-explore. Baka possible in the future ma-explore na rin siya.
Makaabutin na ng 4 months yung simulation. Sige, may question pa ako about the winds. We assume na dry yung winds na to, no?
Yes po.
Or, okay, sige. What do you think would be the effect if moist ng winds na to? Kasi ang bagyo, most probably may dalang ulan and precipitation.
What I can only presume is yung consideration mo ng air density tataas. Pero apart from that, kasi kinoconsider mo na lang na kinikerry ng wind yung water particles mo. So, yung physics hindi ganong maapektuhan. Except nga dun sa density, magiging density na i-consider mo.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think there's another person, Kevin ba? Did you want to ask something?
Hi, hello. Good afternoon po.
Yeah.
First of all, congrats on learned a lot from this presentation. Yung I guess follow-up lang question from siguro it's a follow-up from all the previous questions. Yung when you did these models, this is based on di ba, like local scale, so kaya kinonsider mo yung roughness ng mga surface. Tama, di ba? So part na mention mo yung sa sea data, yung model mo ba, does it assume the ocean is just a thin layer of water, or is kinonsider mo din ba na parang air-sea coupled model siya na nagbibigay din ng feedback yung ocean in terms of giving energy sa atmosphere, or yun nga, or ano lang siya, yung more atmosphere centric yung model mo?
More on atmosphere centric. Then ang assumption na in-implement ko is yung at sea conditions medyo still, so parang flat surface lang siya, flat and smooth surface siya.
Okay, kasi yun nga that means parang yung resolution ng yung parang amount of info is not really as complete as like if you would consider like kahit ilang meters below sea level, kasi 'di ba yung dry yung hinihigop ng cyclone yung water vapor energy galing sa ocean, so yung inassume mo lang na flat siya, parang you're assuming na the tropical cyclone in your model self-sustaining.
Yun
kasi
ang problem hindi magiging temporal yung analysis. Parang puro hindsight lang siya. Na based sa current state, evaluate ko yung winds based dun sa next
So when you did the 25-second parang simulation, it's like getting a frame of each condition.
Yes po.
As parang static condition siya. Tapos parang stinak mo lang siya na parang animation. Ganun. Okay. Kasi, di ba alam naman natin na pag once tropical cyclones leave the ocean and start hitting the land, aside from the friction from the ground that causes it to weaken, wala na rin siyang nahihigop na potential energy from the ocean. So baka isang consideration din yun. Pero I think what I liked about dun sa presentation mo na you were very careful in considering yung surface roughness, especially sa land. So parang I think yung results mo based siya sa perturbations. Kaya 'di ba Eddy's based on perturbations. Yes. So yung roughness ng dinaanan ng bagyo, siya yung nagdahilan bakit nagkaroon ng fraying or nag-iba-ibang wind values at certain spots, right?
Yes.
Pero considering na if siyempre practical reasons din kasi you'll require more computational power kung may kasamang input din si ocean. Pero if ever na you have access to more resources like better computers, better computational power, are you open to extending in study mo to include to include oceanic conditions. Kasi di ba kung balak mo yung i-operationalize for the full Philippines in the future, baka that might be necessary.
Actually, medyo lalayo na po dun sa wind engineering na part. More on magiging coastal engineering na siya na.
Okay.
Na problem.
May comment ako dyan, Kevin.
Okay.
Yung sa una yung tanong mo on the roughness ng sea. Actually, yung roughness, habang lumalakas yung hangin, nag-roughen yung sea, di ba, with the waves. Pero darating siya sa isang point wherein mag-flatten ulit yung sea waves eh. Yung pinaka-top ng waves, mag-flatten siya. And then bababa yung roughness. As far as I remember, around 150 kph na wind speed sa dagat, mag-flatten ulit yung dagat. So actually, yung roughness niya, bababa. So you can consider it as a flat surface ulit. So una yon. Pangalawa, I think yung sinasabi mo na pagka naglupa na hihina siya, di ba? It's actually considered kasi kinuha ni Joshua yung wind niya from JMA, di ba? Yung sa pressure, yung sa pressure ng JMA, which is incorporated doon yung paghina ng lupa. So I think pasok yung na yon, yung point kong yon.
Okay. I see. No, nice. So, last question na lang na considering based on your results, how will this help in terms of influencing policy, especially with building codes, considering na I guess pwede rin itong kasi isama sa broader context na if more typhoons will hit similar paths or mas lumakas ang bagyo in the future, like how do you think this will help shaping and influencing policy, especially kahit LGU level man?
Tanong ko lang kayo, Sir Jaime. Sir Jaime, pwedeng i-open up yung severe wind risk program?
Sige lang.
Yun nga po. Currently, kasi may dinedevelop na may project involving yung Pag-asa on which sinasimulate nga nila yung winds. Parang in determining nga yung local winds all across the Philippines by simulating typhoons. As of now, limited lang sila sa area-based approach. So, merong isang area that merong assumptions ng roughness, then consider yung typhoon boundary layer, then we get yung winds, local winds dun sa area na yun. Pero syempre, limited yun dun sa assumption na all across the area, pare-pareho ng winds. So, dito sa yung methodology na to would open up na yung feature-based approach na based dun sa location ng mga buildings mo, ano yung mga local amplifications mararanasan niya.
Oh, okay. I see. Thank you for explaining.
Okay. Yeah, just to maybe emphasize on the fact na Joshua is in structural. So it's really like yung application will be local scales. So like, for example, if I were to think about you build a city and then where you position the buildings and how the wind and will patterns would change as far as your design or even yung placement ng mga buildings mo, which is done in other parts of the world. Actually, they really look at what will be the effect of you put up a building here and that tall. Will it impact the circulation patterns in another area in the city or in area as far as the cluster of buildings on one side? So I think from that point of view, this level of analysis then becomes useful because you can really see how the sort of the details of the wind patterns or wind dynamics come into that location. In fact, I don't know if you are aware, Joshua, this lady from DLSU did some kind of a study, using LES dyan sa Luneta Park, as far as yung distribution ng mga pollens and so on.
Oh.
It's a small scale, but not typhoon conditions, but high wind conditions, then how the pollens will be distributed, then maybe some areas mitutubo yung mga Yung from some vegetation or some trees or some.
That's
So
nice.
I think that lady had this I don't know MSc or dissertation ballet, but she was a student ng Tokyo Institute of Technology, Jaime. So pero yung thesis niya dito sa Philippines. Part of those, ano ba yan, we had this program, Jaime, on GSPS, 10-year program from 1998 to 2008.
Yes, yes.
She was in that yung MEX Mombusho Scholarship. Anyway, so if there is no more, maybe we can have a closed session.
Yes.
If,
Paano po ba ang ano? Mag-direct po ba ng
ikaw ba yung maybe you can
Siya yung host eh.
you can transfer the host to Jaime or to me,
Okay.
and then I will I think under yung security mo
Okay po. Na-make ko na.
password. Okay. Then I can move each one of the audience here into waiting room.
Okay.
So start with Kevin,
Please excuse us, yes.
and then this Rakoma. Ano bang first name mo, si Rakoma?
Bernard po.
Bernard,
Student niyo po ako dati.
kasi Bachelor of Arts Rakoma to BA. And then si Joshua.